The mall was alive with its usual hum of activity. Shoppers strolled leisurely through the polished corridors. Children laughed as they chased each other around benches, and soft music played in the background. Among the crowd was Mrs. Evelyn Thompson, a 68-year-old grandmother whose warm smile seemed to light up every corner she passed. She had come to the mall that afternoon not for herself, but for her grandson's birthday gift, a small toy car he had been asking about for weeks. Evelyn moved slowly, leaning slightly on her cane as she navigated the bustling environment. Silver hair was neatly tied back, and her eyes sparkled with kindness despite the weariness etched into her face from years of hard work and life's challenges. Despite her age, Evelyn carried herself with dignity, her posture straight and her steps deliberate. She often visited this mall because it reminded her of simpler times when her own children were young, and family outings meant laughter, love, and shared ice cream cones. As Evelyn browsed through one of the stores, carefully inspecting shelves filled with colorful toys, Officer Mark Reynolds stood nearby at his post by the entrance. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with sharp features that many found intimidating. His uniform gave him an air of authority, but beneath it lay a simmering frustration. Mark believed strongly in rules and order, though over time his strict adherence to protocol had hardened into something less forgiving, something colder. Mark's gaze swept across the crowd, scanning for anything out of place. To him, the world felt like it was changing too quickly, slipping away from the values he thought mattered most. As much as he tried to convince himself otherwise, there were moments when his biases surfaced, clouding his judgment and making him see threats where none existed. Today would be no different. Unbeknownst to Evelyn, Mark's attention soon shifted toward her. It started innocently enough. He noticed her moving slowly, occasionally stopping to catch her breath. But instead of seeing an elderly woman enjoying her day, Mark saw someone who didn't belong. In his mind, people like Evelyn shouldn't take up space in places meant for others. His thoughts spiraled further when he saw her accidentally bump into a display stand, knocking over a stack of toys. "Oh dear," Evelyn muttered under her breath, bending down awkwardly to pick them up. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to arrange the fallen items back onto the shelf. A store employee approached to help, offering a polite smile, but Mark misinterpreted the scene entirely. To him, it wasn't an accident, it was disruption, and disruption needed to be dealt with swiftly. Without thinking twice, Mark strode over, his boots clicking against the tiled floor. "Ma'am," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the ambient noise. Evelyn turned, startled, her wide eyes meeting his stern expression. "You need to watch where you're going," he continued, his tone accusatory. "This isn't your living room." Evelyn blinked, taken aback by the sudden confrontation. "I'm so sorry," she replied softly, clutching her cane tighter. "It was just an accident. I'll fix it right away." But Mark wasn't listening. Something inside him snapped. He couldn't explain why, even if he wanted to. Maybe it was the long hours on duty. Maybe it was the weight of unresolved anger within him. Or maybe it was simply the color of Evelyn's skin triggering unconscious prejudices. Whatever the reason, his next action shocked everyone around them. In a flash, Mark reached out and shoved Evelyn backward. The force sent her stumbling, her frail body crashing into another display. Gasps erupted from nearby shoppers as Evelyn landed on the ground, her cane clattering beside her. Tears welled up in her eyes, not just from the physical pain, but from the humiliation of being treated so cruelly in front of strangers. For a moment, everything froze. The cheerful chatter faded into silence, replaced by horrified stares and murmurs of disbelief. No one dared to intervene, unsure of what might happen next. Even Mark seemed stunned by his own actions, his chest rising and falling rapidly as reality began to sink in. Little did anyone know, Evelyn's son, Marcus Thompson, was already on his way to meet her. Unaware of what had just transpired, he hurried through the parking lot, eager to surprise his mother and help carry her purchases home. What awaited him inside the mall, however, would change everything for both him and Officer Reynolds. Marcus Thompson had always been a man of action. At 35 years old, he carried himself with the same quiet strength and determination that his mother, Evelyn, had instilled in him from a young age. A former college football player turned community advocate, Marcus spent most of his days working tirelessly to uplift his neighborhood, mentoring kids, organizing food drives, and speaking out against injustice wherever he saw it. He was respected by many, not just for his accomplishments, but for the genuine care he showed toward others. That afternoon, Marcus had left work early to meet his mom at the mall. It wasn't often he got to spend time with her during the week, so he looked forward to these little moments as he walked briskly toward the entrance. His phone buzzed, in his pocket a text from Evelyn saying she'd found the perfect gift for his son's birthday. Smiling to himself, Marcus quickened his pace, eager to see the excitement on her face. But as soon as Marcus stepped inside the mall, something felt off. The usual cheerful atmosphere was replaced by an eerie stillness. People stood frozen in place, their faces pale and expressions tense. Some whispered urgently to each other while others simply stared ahead, wide-eyed. Confused, Marcus scanned the area, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then he saw her, his mother, sitting on the cold floor amidst scattered toys, clutching her cane tightly. Her glasses were askew, and tears streamed down her cheeks. Beside her stood a tall man in a police uniform, his posture rigid and his face flushed red. Anger surged through Marcus like a tidal wave, but he forced himself to stay calm. For now, he needed answers. "Mom." Marcus called out, rushing to. Evelyn sighed. She looked up, relief washing over her features when she saw him. "What happened? Are you okay?" Before Evelyn could respond, Officer Mark Reynolds stepped forward, his voice firm but laced with unease. "Sir, I need you to step back. Is a private matter?" "A private matter?" Cut him off, his voice rising slightly. He towered over the officer. His broad shoulders squared as he locked eyes with Mark. "My mother is sitting on the ground crying, and you think this is a private matter?" The crowd around them began to shift uncomfortably, some people inching closer to hear the exchange while others backed away, fearful of what might happen next. Marcus knelt beside Evelyn, gently helping her to her feet. "Did he hurt you, Mom?" he asked softly, his tone filled with concern. Evelyn hesitated, glancing nervously at the officer before nodding faintly. He pushed me," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to knock those things over. It was just an accident." Hearing those words ignited a fire within Marcus. He turned back to Mark, his jaw clenched. "You pushed my mother? An elderly woman who clearly didn't deserve any of this?" Mark's face reddened further, though whether from guilt or defensiveness was unclear. "She was causing a disturbance," he replied stiffly. "People need to follow the rules? A disturbance?" Marcus echoed incredulously. "Knocking over a stack of toys is not a crime. Even if it were, does that justify laying your hands on someone twice your age? Someone who can barely stand without her cane?" By now, the tension between the two men was palpable. Had gathered in a loose circle around them, their phones raised to record the unfolding scene. Whispers rippled through the crowd as more people realized what had transpired. Some muttered angrily about the officer's behavior, while others expressed sympathy for Evelyn. Mark seemed to shrink under the weight of the attention. For all his bravado earlier, he hadn't anticipated being confronted by someone like Marcus, someone who exuded authority and confidence yet radiated compassion. Feeling cornered, Mark tried to regain control of the situation. "Look, sir, I don't know who you are, but you need to calm down. If you interfere with law enforcement, I'm interfering because my mother deserves better than this," Marcus interrupted, his voice steady but commanding. "And so do all the people here who witnessed how you treated her. You're supposed to protect us, not abuse your power." The officer opened his mouth to retort, but no words came out. Instead, his gaze darted around the room, taking in the sea of disapproving faces pointed in his direction. The reality of the situation finally hit him. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. As the confrontation escalated, a security guard approached cautiously, attempting to mediate. Ada, everyone please, let's try to resolve this peacefully," he said, holding up his hands. But Marcus wasn't ready to back down, not yet. "Peacefully," Marcus repeated, turning to address the growing audience. "This isn't about peace, it's about accountability. How many times have we seen this kind of behavior go unchecked? How many more mothers, fathers, grandparents will be treated this way before someone says enough? His words resonated deeply with those around him. Heads nodded in agreement, and murmurs of support grew louder. Even the security guard looked uneasy, unsure of how to handle the mounting pressure. Meanwhile, Evelyn tugged lightly on Marcus's sleeve. "Please, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice soft but urgent. "Let's not make things worse." Marcus glanced down at her, seeing the fear lingering in her eyes despite her attempt to remain composed. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to tamp down the rage boiling inside him. His mother was right, they couldn't risk escalating the situation further. "Not here, not now." "Fine," Marcus said finally, addressing Mark. "We'll leave. But this isn't over. You may wear a badge, but that doesn't give you the right to treat people like they're less than human. Trust me, I'll make sure. Everyone knows exactly what happened here today." With that, Marcus wrapped an arm protectively around Evelyn and guided her toward the exit. The crowd parted to let them pass, many offering words of encouragement or placing gentle hands on Evelyn's shoulder as she went by. Behind them, Mark stood rooted to the spot, his face pale and his fists clenched. The weight of his actions and the consequences they would bring was only beginning to dawn on him as Marcus and Evelyn made their way out of the mall. The tension that had gripped the crowd began to shift into something else. Action. Phones were still raised, capturing every moment, and within minutes, snippets of the incident started flooding social media platforms. Videos of Officer Mark Reynolds shoving Evelyn spread like wildfire, accompanied by captions like "Elderly woman assaulted by cop and justice for Mrs. Thompson." Marcus helped Evelyn into the passenger seat of his car, ensuring she was comfortable before closing the door gently. His hands trembled slightly as he leaned against the vehicle, taking a moment to process everything that had just happened. He knew this wasn't just about his mother anymore. It was about something much bigger. This was about accountability, fairness, and standing up against the misuse of power. "Are you sure you're okay, Mom?" Marcus asked softly, leaning down to look at her through the open window. Evelyn nodded, though her eyes remained distant, clouded with both pain and embarrassment. "I'll be fine, sweetheart," she said, forcing a small smile. "But what about you? You shouldn't have to deal with all this because of me." Marcus shook his head firmly. "This isn't your fault, Mom. None of it is. What happened in there was wrong, and people need to know about it. They need to see the truth." Back inside the mall, chaos erupted as whispers turned into heated discussions. Some shoppers approached the security desk, demanding answers. Others confronted Officer Reynolds directly, their voices rising in anger. One woman, holding her young daughter's hand, stepped forward boldly. "How could you do that to an elderly woman? She didn't deserve any of it." Mark stood frozen, his earlier confidence crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny. For the first time in his career, he felt truly exposed. The badge he wore, which once symbolized authority and respect, now felt heavy with shame. His colleagues looked away, unwilling to defend him, while the mall manager quietly ushered him into a private office to avoid further escalation. Outside, Marcus pulled out his phone and opened his social media accounts. As a community advocate, he had built a strong following over the years, and he knew how powerful their voices could be when united. With shaking fingers, he typed out a post. "Today, my 68-year-old mother was assaulted by a police officer at our local mall for no reason other than being clumsy and elderly. Enough is enough. We cannot stay silent when those sworn to protect us abuse their power. Share this post. Speak up. Let's demand justice together." He attached one of the videos circulating online and hit post. Within seconds, notifications began pouring in, likes, shares, comments of outrage and support. Strangers from across the city chimed in, vowing to take action. Local news outlets picked up the story almost immediately, sending reporters to the scene. Meanwhile, Evelyn watched, her son with a mix of pride and worry. "Be careful, Marcus," she cautioned. "People like him, they don't like being challenged. You might put yourself in danger." "I know, Mom," Marcus replied, his tone resolute. "But if I don't stand up now, who will? This isn't just about you. It's about every person who's ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin or how old they are. We can't let fear stop us from doing what's right. By evening, the story had gone viral. Protesters began gathering outside the mall, holding signs that read "Justice for Evelyn" and "Accountability Now." Community leaders arrived to speak, amplifying Marcus's message. Even local politicians issued statements condemning the officer's actions and calling for an investigation. Inside the police department, tensions ran high. Mark sat alone in a dimly lit room, replaying the events in his mind. He hadn't intended for things to spiral so far out of control. In his mind, he had simply been enforcing the rules, but now, faced with the consequences of his actions, he couldn't deny the ugliness of his behavior. His colleagues avoided eye contact with him, and the chief of police called him into a meeting to discuss next steps. "You've brought a lot of negative attention to this department," the chief said sternly, slamming a stack of printed social media posts onto the table. "We're looking at suspending you pending an internal investigation. Depending on what we find, this could go much further." Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry. For the first time, he realized the full weight of his choices and the damage they had caused. As night fell, Marcus received a call from a prominent civil rights attorney offering to represent Evelyn pro bono. "Your mother deserves justice," the lawyer said firmly. "We're going to make sure she gets it." For Marcus and Evelyn, the fight was only beginning. But as they prepared for the road ahead, they found strength in each other, in the countless strangers who had rallied behind them, determined to turn outrage into change. The days that followed the incident felt like a whirlwind for both Marcus and Evelyn. What had started as a quiet afternoon at the mall had exploded into a citywide conversation about accountability, justice, and systemic issues within law enforcement. News outlets couldn't stop talking about it. Social media was ablaze with hashtags like #JusticeForEvelyn and #EnoughIsEnough. Protesters continued to gather outside the mall, their numbers growing each day, demanding answers and reforms. For Evelyn, the attention was overwhelming. She had always lived a simple life, working hard, raising her children, and finding joy. In small moments, now she found herself at the center of a storm she never asked to be part of. Reporters camped outside her home, hoping for an interview. Neighbors stopped by to express their support, bringing casseroles and kind words. While Evelyn appreciated the outpouring of love, she couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability that lingered deep inside her. "I just want this to be over," Evelyn confessed to Marcus one evening as they sat together on the porch watching. The sun dipped below the horizon. Her voice was soft but tinged with exhaustion. "I didn't do anything wrong, Marcus. Why does everyone have to look at me like I'm some kind of symbol?" Marcus reached over, placing a comforting hand on hers. "Because you are, Mom. Not because you chose to be, but because what happened to you isn't fair. People see your story and realize it could have been their mom, their grandma, or even them. That's why we can't stay silent." Evelyn sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I understand, sweetheart, but sometimes I wonder if standing up is worth all the pain." "It has to be," Marcus replied firmly. "If we don't fight now, nothing will change. And I'm not letting anyone scare us into backing down." Meanwhile, Officer Mark Reynolds faced mounting pressure from all sides. Suspended without pay pending the investigation, he spent most of his time holed up in his apartment, avoiding calls from friends and family. The weight of public scrutiny crushed him. Every news segment, every protest sign with his name on it, served as a reminder of the damage he'd caused. Sleep evaded him. When he closed his eyes, he saw Evelyn's tear-streaked face staring back at him. One night, unable to bear the silence any longer, Mark poured himself a drink and turned on the TV. Predictably, his actions dominated the headlines. A reporter interviewed Marcus, who spoke passionately about justice and reform. "No one should live in fear of those who are supposed to protect them," Marcus said, his voice steady and unwavering. "This isn't just about my mother. It's about creating a world where everyone feels safe." Mark switched off the TV, guilt gnawing at him. He had always prided himself on being a man of order, someone who upheld the law. But now he questioned everything. Had he become the very thing he claimed to stand against? Was he really the villain people made him out to be? Desperate for guidance, Mark decided to visit his older sister, Rachel. She was the only person he trusted enough to confide in. When he arrived at her house, she took one look at his haggard appearance and ushered him inside. "What's going on, Mark?" Rachel asked, concern etched on her face. "You look like you haven't slept in days." Mark hesitated, unsure of how to begin. Finally, he blurted out, "I messed up, Rach. Big time. I hurt someone, an elderly woman, and now everyone hates me." Rachel listened patiently as Mark recounted the events at the mall. When he finished, she leaned forward, her expression serious. "Mark, I know you believe in rules and authority, but rules aren't meant to harm people, they're meant to protect them. You lost sight of that, and you need to figure out how to make things right." "But how?" Mark asked, his voice breaking. "Even if I apologize, it won't undo what I did." "No, it won't," Rachel admitted. "Apologize. But apologizing is a start. Owning up to your mistakes shows courage. And maybe, just maybe, it'll help you find forgiveness not just from others, but from yourself." As Mark wrestled with his conscience, the legal process began to unfold. The civil rights attorney representing Evelyn filed a formal complaint against Mark and the police department, citing excessive use of force and racial bias. A hearing was scheduled, and the community rallied behind Evelyn, organizing fundraisers to cover legal fees and ensure she had the resources she needed. At the same time, Marcus worked tirelessly to keep the momentum going. He gave interviews, attended rallies, and collaborated with local leaders to push for policy changes. Despite the challenges, he remained steadfast in his mission to turn his mother's pain into progress. For Evelyn, however, the hardest part was yet to come. As the hearing approached, she knew she would have to relive the humiliation of that day in court. But with Marcus by her side, she found strength she didn't know she had. Together, they prepared to face whatever came next, determined to seek justice not just for themselves, but for everyone who deserved better. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the hearing began. Reporters filled the back rows, notebooks and recording devices at the ready. Community members packed the benches, their faces a mix of anger, hope, and determination. At the center of it all sat Evelyn Thompson, her posture straight but her hands trembling slightly in her lap. Beside her was Marcus, his presence a steady source of strength, while across the aisle sat Officer Mark Reynolds, flanked by his attorney. The air felt heavy, charged with emotion. For Evelyn, this wasn't just about seeking justice, it was about reclaiming her dignity. She had spent countless nights rehearsing what she would say, practicing how to keep her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. Marcus had reminded her repeatedly that she didn't need to be perfect. She only needed to tell the truth. As the judge entered and called the room to order, the tension reached its peak. The prosecutor stood first, laying out the case against Officer Reynolds. He presented evidence video footage from the mall, witness testimonies, and medical reports detailing Evelyn's injuries. Each piece painted a damning picture of an officer who had overstepped his authority, letting bias cloud his judgment. When it came time for Evelyn to testify, the entire room fell silent. Slowly, she rose from her seat and made her way to the stand. Her steps were deliberate, each one fueled by courage she hadn't known she possessed. As she took her place, she glanced at Marcus, who gave her an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak. "I went to the mall that day to buy a gift for my grandson," Evelyn said, her voice soft but firm. "I didn't expect anything unusual to happen. I accidentally knocked over some toys. It was an honest mistake. But instead of helping me or even speaking kindly, Officer Reynolds pushed me. He treated me like I was worthless." Her words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. Tears glistened in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. The jury listened intently, their expressions shifting between sympathy and disbelief that such an act could occur in broad daylight. Even the judge seemed moved, jotting down notes with furrowed brows. When it was Mark's turn to take the stand, the atmosphere shifted again. His attorney tried to frame his actions as a misunderstanding, emphasizing his years of service and dedication to law enforcement. But under cross-examination, cracks began to show. The prosecutor asked pointed questions about why Mark had reacted so aggressively to such a minor incident. "Did you consider Mrs. Thompson's age when you shoved her?" the prosecutor asked sharply. "Or did you see her as someone who didn't belong in the mall?" Mark hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. I thought she was causing a disturbance," he stammered. "I wanted to maintain order." "At what cost?" the prosecutor pressed. "Was maintaining order worth humiliating an elderly woman in front of dozens of people? Was it worth risking her safety?" Mark had no answer. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he avoided eye contact with both the prosecutor and Evelyn. It was clear to everyone in the room that his defenses were crumbling. Outside the courthouse, the crowd grew restless. Protesters chanted slogans, holding signs demanding accountability. Local activists gave speeches, urging the community to remain vigilant. Among them was Marcus, who stepped away briefly to address reporters. "This isn't just about winning a case," Marcus said, his voice resonating with conviction. "It's about sending a message that no one is above the law, not even those who enforce it. We're here today because we believe in justice, not revenge." Back inside, closing arguments wrapped up. The defense pleaded for leniency, arguing that Mark was a good officer who had simply made a mistake. The prosecution countered fiercely, reminding the court that mistakes rooted in prejudice have lasting consequences. Finally, the judge instructed the jury to deliberate. As they filed out of the room, Evelyn leaned back in her chair, exhausted but resolute. Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder, offering silent reassurance. Whatever the verdict, they knew they had already sparked change that couldn't be undone. Hours passed before the jury returned. When they did, the foreperson stood and delivered their decision. Guilty on charges of excessive use of force and misconduct. Gasps erupted in the courtroom, followed by murmurs of relief and triumph. Evelyn closed her eyes, a single tear rolling down her cheek. Justice had been served. But for Mark, the verdict marked the beginning of a long road toward redemption. Journey he wasn't sure he was ready for. The courtroom erupted into a mix of cheers and murmurs as the guilty verdict was announced. For Evelyn, it was a moment of vindication, a public acknowledgement that what had happened to her was wrong. But instead of feeling triumphant, she felt drained. The weight of the past weeks, the media attention, the protests, the emotional toll of reliving that day in court had taken its toll. All she wanted now was peace. Marcus, on the other hand, allowed himself a small smile. He glanced at his mother, seeing the relief in her eyes, and then toward Mark, whose head was bowed low. Guilt and shame radiated off the former officer, who sat motionless as the judge delivered his sentencing, a suspension without pay, mandatory counseling and community service hours working with marginalized groups. It wasn't prison time. But Marcus knew this punishment carried its own kind of weight, one that might force Mark to confront the deeper issues within himself. As the crowd dispersed outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Evelyn and Marcus, eager for statements. Marcus stepped forward, shielding his mother from the cameras. "Today's verdict is a step in the right direction," he said firmly. "But true justice isn't just about punishing one person. It's about creating lasting change. We need accountability, education, and reform, so no one else has to go through what my mother did." His words resonated deeply with those gathered, earning nods of agreement. Activists promised to continue pushing for policy changes while local leaders pledged support for initiatives aimed at addressing systemic biases within law enforcement. Marcus knew the fight wasn't over, but for now, they had won an important battle. Meanwhile, Mark sat alone in his car after the hearing, staring blankly at the steering wheel. The verdict replayed in his mind like a broken record. Guilty. The word echoed relentlessly, stripping away any remnants of pride or self-righteousness he'd once clung to. He thought about his career years spent enforcing laws, believing he was making a difference, and realized how far he had strayed from the values he claimed to uphold. That evening, Mark visited his sister Rachel again. She opened the door to find him looking even more defeated than before. Without a word, she led him to the couch and handed him a cup of tea. "You look like you've been through hell," she said gently. "I have," Mark admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can fix this, Ratch. Everyone hates me. I hate myself." Rachel sat beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Hating yourself won't help anyone, least of all Mrs. Thompson. If you really want to make things right, you need to start by facing the truth, not just about what you did, but why you did it." Mark nodded slowly, though doubt clouded his expression. "How do I even begin?" "Start small," Rachel suggested. "Apologize sincerely, not because you think it'll erase what happened, but because it's the first step toward healing. And then commit to learning. Read books. Attend workshops. Listen to people who've experienced injustice firsthand. You can't undo the past, but you can choose to grow from it." Taking Rachel's advice to heart, Mark decided to write a letter to Evelyn. It wasn't easy. Every sentence felt inadequate, every word insufficient to express the depth of his remorse. But he poured his heart into it, acknowledging his actions and taking full responsibility. He ended the letter with a promise: "I will spend the rest of my life working to ensure that no one else suffers because of someone like me." Days later, Evelyn received the letter. At first, she hesitated to open it, unsure if she was ready to hear anything from the man who had hurt her. But curiosity got the better of her, and she read it quietly, her brow furrowing as she absorbed each line. When she finished, she set the letter aside, conflicted. Forgiveness didn't come easily, especially when the wound still felt fresh. Marcus noticed the letter and asked cautiously, "What does it say?" Evelyn sighed, folding her hands in her lap. "He says he's sorry, that he knows what he did was wrong and wants to make amends." "And do you believe him?" Marcus asked, his tone neutral. "I don't know," Evelyn replied honestly. "Maybe he means it, maybe he doesn't, but whether I forgive him or not, that's not the point. What matters is that he starts doing the work to change, not just for me, but for everyone." Though skeptical, Marcus agreed. True redemption would require action, not just words. As the days turned into weeks, news spread that Mark had begun attending diversity training sessions and volunteering at a senior center. Some dismissed his efforts as performative, while others saw them as genuine attempts at growth. Only time would tell which was true. For Evelyn and Marcus, life slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as possible. They continued advocating for justice, using their platform to amplify voices often ignored. Though scars remained, they found solace in knowing they had sparked meaningful conversations and inspired others to demand better. But the story wasn't over yet. One question lingered in the air: would forgiveness ever be possible? And if so, what would it take? Months had passed since the trial, and life for Evelyn and Marcus settled into a new rhythm. The media frenzy had died down, replaced by quieter but more impactful changes. Local lawmakers introduced reforms aimed at addressing bias in law enforcement, inspired in part by Evelyn's case. Marcus continued his advocacy work, speaking at schools and community centers about the importance of standing up against injustice. Though proud of what they had achieved, Evelyn still carried the emotional scars of that day. Forgiveness wasn't something she could rush. It needed time. Meanwhile, Mark Reynolds was on a journey of his own. His days were filled with introspection and hard work. He attended counseling sessions where he confronted uncomfortable truths about himself, the biases he hadn't realized he held, the anger he hadn't known how to manage. At the senior center where he volunteered, he listened to stories from elderly residents who reminded him of Evelyn. Their kindness humbled him, even as their wary eyes served as constant reminders of the trust he'd broken. One crisp autumn morning, Mark decided it was time to take another step forward. He wrote a second letter to Evelyn, this one accompanied by an invitation to meet face-to-face if she was willing. "I know I can never undo what I did," he wrote, "but I hope we can talk, not because I expect forgiveness, but because I want to understand how I hurt you so I can do better." Evelyn received the letter with mixed emotions. She read it aloud to Marcus, her voice trembling slightly. "What do you think, sweetheart? she asked after finishing. Should I see him? Marcus hesitated, weighing his response carefully. It's your decision, Mom. No one can tell you what's right or wrong here. Just ask yourself, will seeing him help you heal? Or will it reopen old wounds? After much thought, Evelyn decided to meet Mark not out of obligation, but out of curiosity. If nothing else, she wanted to see if the man who had once treated her so cruelly had truly changed. The meeting took place at a quiet park. It was chosen for its neutral atmosphere. Evelyn arrived first, seated on a bench beneath a canopy of golden leaves. When Mark approached, his steps were hesitant, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Mrs. Thompson, he began, his voice shaky, thank you for agreeing to meet me. Evelyn nodded, studying him closely. Gone was the stern, imposing figure from the mall. In his place stood a man visibly burdened by regret. You're welcome, she said simply. Let's sit. They sat side by side, an awkward silence stretching between them. Finally, Mark spoke. There's no excuse for what I did to you. I let my biases blind me, and I failed you in the worst way possible. I'm sorry for shoving you, for humiliating you, for making you feel like you didn't matter. Cuss. You do matter more than I'll ever be able to express. How we did. Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes, but she blinked them away. Do you really mean that? She asked softly. Yes, Mark replied earnestly, every word. I've spent these past months trying to understand why I acted the way I did. And I've learned a lot about myself, things I wish I hadn't. But I'm committed to changing, to being better. Evelyn nodded slowly, absorbing his words. Isn't easy, she said, and forgiveness. That takes time, too. I won't lie to you, Mr. Reynolds. What you did hurt me deeply. Some days I still feel it. Mark lowered his head, accepting her honesty without defense. I understand, he said quietly, and I don't expect you to forgive me. Can do is keep working to earn back the trust I lost, not just yours, but everyone's. As they talked, Evelyn found herself feeling something unexpected, a glimmer of hope. She didn't forgive Mark entirely that day, nor did she feel ready to. But she saw sincerity in his eyes and effort in his actions. That was enough for now. When the conversation ended, they parted ways with a mutual understanding. Evelyn returned home, sharing the details with Marcus, who listened intently. He seemed genuine, she admitted. Maybe people can change if they're willing to try. Over time, Evelyn and Mark crossed paths occasionally at community events, during volunteer work, or simply around town. Each encounter was brief but meaningful, a reminder that healing wasn't linear. For Evelyn, it was a chance to witness growth. For Mark, it was an opportunity to prove he was more than his mistakes. In the end, justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about transformation. Evelyn and Marcus had sparked a movement, inspiring others to demand accountability, while fostering compassion. And though forgiveness remained a personal journey for Evelyn, she found peace, knowing that her courage had planted seeds of change in hearts far beyond her own. Sometimes, the hardest battles lead to the greatest victories, not just for individuals, but for communities united by a shared vision of fairness and humanity.